The British Army's interest in aviation began with balloons. After 15 years of experimentation, a trials unit was formed by the Royal Engineers in 1878. Captain James Templar was appointed as their first ballooning instructor. Balloons were first used on active service in Bechuanaland in 1884 and in the Sudan the following year. However, it was not until the Boer War at the turn of the century that balloons came into their own, being successfully used as observation platforms. In the early 1900s, as the unit was enlarged, Lieutenant Colonel John Capper of the Royal Engineers took command. A balloon factory was created at Farnborough, and Capper became its superintendent. This factory was the precursor of the famous Royal Aircraft establishment. Before he handed over command to Capper, Templar had begun development of the next stage of military aviation, the airship.
The New Secundus was the first airship the British Army had built, and it was captained by Capper. It was powered by a French Antoinette engine, of which the British Army had purchased two. And on one of its flights, it flew over London, up Pall Mall, around St Paul's Cathedral, and it landed in the evening at Crystal Palace. Unfortunately, during the night where it was tethered, a heavy gale got up, and the soldiers who were guarding it couldn't control the balloon, and so they actually bayoneted the balloon to death.
Further airships such as the Beta followed, but by the end of the decade, powered aircraft were starting to take their place. One of the main influences in this transition was Samuel Cody, the flamboyant American entertainer who had developed man-carrying kites. In 1906, Capper employed Cody as kiting instructor to the balloon companies at Farnborough. Cody, though, had ambitions towards powered flight. In September 1908, Cody's British Army Aeroplane No. 1 flew for the first time. In 1912, one of Cody's aircraft won the British military trials and was bought for the Army.
Well, Cody was very important to British aviation because he was the first person to fly a British machine in the United Kingdom, although he was an American citizen. And he then became the British Army instructor in aviation and in kite manufacturing at Farnborough Airfield. Cody was getting ready for an air race, which was sponsored by the Daily Mail in 1913. He modified the aircraft. It was a float aircraft. In other words, it was a forerunner of a seaplane. And whilst he was doing a circuit of Farnborough Airfield, unfortunately he crashed and died.
From 1911, the Army's mixed collection of aircraft was under the control of the newly formed Air Battalion. However, within a year, enormous growth led to the founding of the Royal Flying Corps. 3 years of exercises and manoeuvres between 1912 and 1914 barely prepared the Royal Flying Corps for war.
During the First War, there was an enormous increase in the use of aircraft and the building of aircraft by all the combatants. And in Britain, it was necessary, therefore, to build as many types as we could. One must realize that everything was in an experimental stage, that various makers produced different kinds of aircraft for different purposes. Some were required as fighter aircraft, some were required as bombers, that is to say, they had to be a bit bigger so that they could carry an observer as well as the bombs, which he had to sight. Therefore, there was a variety of aircraft in production by various makers. So people learning to fly, therefore, had to get the experience of maneuvering these new machines, and particularly getting them off the ground and getting them back down to the ground safely. It was quite easy to learn to fly. Once you were airborne, in about 10 minutes and the controls were in your hand, provided you had sufficient height for safety, you could perform the necessary functions of turning, climbing and descending. The great thing was to be able to maneuver that aircraft, to first of all get it off the ground, and secondly, after you had completed your flight, to get it down again. So most of the time was spent by aviators learning to fly in performing those maneuvers. I think that pupils getting into the aircraft for the first time and taking off are rather astonished as to how easy it all is, because the aircraft gains forward motion running along the grass, and all of a sudden, without any apparent reason, you find yourself several feet above the ground already. And instead of bumping, you're in very easy forward flight. And from then on, it is only necessary to open the throttle and climb to the height that you want to cruise at.
In 1914, the Royal Flying Corps sent 64 machines to France at the outbreak of the First World War. The role of the pup in the Royal Flying Corps was used as a fighter, and it was called a scout. And it was the very first aircraft dedicated to fighting the German in the air on equal terms. Because up until then, every aircraft had been designed as a reconnaissance aircraft, a sturdy airplane that would fly in prevailing winds from A to B, but was very difficult to maneuver in a dogfight. And because of the casualties caused on the Royal Flying Corps by the Germans, it was necessary to introduce a very fast, agile fighter like the Sopwith Pup.
Well, this type of aircraft, Sopwith Pup, is typical of its period. That is to say, it's made of the lightest and strongest materials available, which would be wood and cotton and bracing wires. And the problem in those days, of course, was to get the sufficient lift of the aircraft to carry the weight of the engine powerful enough to get it off the ground. There was a continuous battle between power and weight ratios. Well, these were built as fighter aircraft, and therefore weight was very important. They had to carry machine guns and ammunition, obviously, for fighting, and those items themselves are quite heavy. But the endurance was really necessary to get the thing to get the aircraft airborne, and to patrol a certain limited area of operations. So if they could give them an endurance of about 2 hours, 2.5 hours, that meant to say that the weight of petrol that had to be carried would be minimized in order to give the best functional performance.
The Sopwith Pup carried 2 machine guns, 2 Vickers machine guns, 303, and these was fitted on the cowling, and they would fire through the propeller of the aircraft. And this was a great step forward in aerial fighting, because up until that time, of course, guns were either fitted to the top of the main plane or fired at the side of an angle, which wasn't very good for aerial warfare.
Oh, a Sopwith Pup would have a takeoff speed at about 50 knots and a cruising speed of about 60 to 70 knots. At top speed could be, by opening the engine full, could probably get up to about 80 to 90 knots. A Sopwith Pup had a ceiling of somewhere like 15,000 feet. They could climb higher, but at that altitude, obviously, they were very near stalling speed. So it wasn't possible to get very much higher than that, but the operational area in which they performed, of course, was quite considerable.
The First World War saw massive aircraft development. The early spotter planes had to be armed, and rifles soon gave way to machine guns. Air superiority moved between Britain and Germany as new purpose-built fighters were introduced. It was not until the appearance of the Bristol fighter, the SC-5A, and the Sopwith Camel that Britain finally achieved mastery of the air. During the war, 35,000 pilots were trained by the Royal Flying Corps. Over 8,000 were killed, many of them aged 19 or 20, with less than 30 hours flying experience. A pilot learnt quickly if he wanted to survive. When the RAF was formed, the Royal Flying Corps had fought in many theatres of war and had won no less than 13 VCs. Lieutenant William Leaf Robinson, 39 Squadron. Captain Lionel Wilmot Brabazon Rees, 32 Squadron. Lieutenant Gilbert Stuart Martin Insull, 11 Squadron. Second Lieutenant James Byford McCudden, 56 Squadron. Lieutenant Alan Gerard, 66 Squadron. Lieutenant Alan Arnott MacLeod, 2 Squadron. Captain William Avery Bishop, 60 Squadron. Lieutenant Albert Ball, 56 Squadron. Lieutenant Frank Hubert McNamara, 67 Australian Squadron. Sergeant Thomas Motorshead, 20 Squadron. Lieutenant William Bernard Rhodes Morehouse, 2 Squadron. Captain John Aidan Liddell, 7 Squadron. Captain Lano George Hawker, 6 Squadron.
The Royal Air Force was formed on the 1st of April 1918 because of the bombing of London, Felixstowe and Folkestone by German bombers, which caused an uproar amongst the civilian population. It caused the Air Board to get General Smuts to form a committee and investigate the possibility of an independent Air Force. And subsequently, it came up with the idea of the Royal Air Force. And they took over all responsibilities to guard not only the home front, but the Western Front, Mesopotamia, and other places throughout the world in the First World War.
During World War I, artillery observation was probably one of the most important tasks for the Royal Flying Corps. And to do this, they had a number of aeroplanes which were specialised for artillery observation. And the cooperation between the Army and the Royal Flying Corps, naturally the Royal Flying Corps being part of the Army, was excellent. Although they worked out excellent means of controlling the guns, as the time went on and as the aeroplanes got faster and faster between the wars, and they operated in bigger and bigger airfields and further away from the guns, it became apparent that we needed a light aircraft which was capable of landing quite near the guns, cooperating with the guns, and preferably flown by gunners who were expert shots. And in fact, in the 1930s, this idea was put up. A certain officer called then Captain Bazley and a Major Parham put the idea forward and wrote articles and lobbied people, and incredibly, although there was a great deal of opposition from the Royal Air Force, in the about 1938, approval was given to start a small flight of light aircraft. So at the early stages of World War II, it was decided that they would order some Stinsons from the Americans, which was quite a large aeroplane. Unfortunately, or fortunately, they were put on board a cargo ship with a cargo of cheesies. And when they arrived at this end, they were virtually flat. And so there was no possibility of using it. I think one remained. So the only solution was to go and have a look around the British market. Unfortunately, they found a thing called a Taylorcraft, which was really purely a club aeroplane, never designed for military use at all. Two-seater with a small engine, no flaps, and didn't even have a radio. And the whole aircraft was quite difficult to see out of, but for an observation aircraft wasn't a great advantage. However, Oster people of Rearsby got hold of the design, and because of recommendations made by pilots, they were able to improve it quite considerably, and the Oster Mark III was the result. And that had flaps, and it had a better engine, and it was capable of doing its job. They managed to scrounge quite a number of these things, at least enough to start trials, and a flight was formed and carried out trials, and it was proved pretty well conclusively that they would be able to survive attacks from fighter aircraft, and by flying low, generally succeed in controlling the guns. By 1943, the first AEROP, that's Air Observation Post Squadron, was formed and ready to go overseas. Now, an AEROP squadron consisted of a number of these light Taylorcrafts, as they were called then, later to be called Osters, and off they went to war for the first time in Tunisia. And that was a fairly hot war because the Germans were obviously in very strong situations. There were a lot of opposition in the way of aircraft, anti-aircraft fire, but they survived. The next place they were involved in was in the Far East, and one squadron, 656, was responsible for the entire British corps there operating in the jungle. And of course it was a very difficult environment for light aircraft. The jungle, the humidity in the jungle and the wet caused the canvas to come off the wings, and they were difficult to start, but they did a wonderful job. From there, of course, the next operation was Normandy and D-Day, and again, by that time, about 8 squadrons were involved. The squadrons went over with their ground parties at D-Day and very shortly afterwards, and they operated all throughout the rest of the war. But there's no doubt about it. Field Marshal Montgomery himself stated that the Oster considerably enhanced the power of the artillery and their ability to bring down fire in the right place at the right time. But it was a nice aeroplane to fly. It was easy. And in a field about 300 yards long, the flaps were effective. It wasn't very fast. 100 knots is about all you could get out of it, but that was quite enough for the job in hand. And it was manoeuvrable. And if you got jumped by the opposition aircraft, it was possible to, as one pilot actually did, find a depression in the ground and flew round and round and round, and so that the enemy aircraft couldn't get their guns to bear.
The Oster performed the role in the area extremely well. It was a very manoeuvrable aircraft, good vision, fly at low speeds, could fly beneath the horizon in between the hill lines to keep away from any observers. And for example, on D-Day +3, one Oster aircraft pilot, Major Lyle, commanded 600 guns in mid-channel onto enemy positions. So it was a very successful airplane.
And then, of course, in peacetime, I'd mentioned that they had the Mark 6 and a trainer called the Mark 7. And then the very last Oster, before Aero P was merged into the Army Air Corps, was the Mark 9, which was a very capable aeroplane, although it wasn't very fast, and it was specially designed for the job.
At the beginning of 1940, there was an introduction of airborne forces by the German army. This was shock troops, very fast, very quick. And it was apparent this was a new way forward in warfare. And so Winston Churchill ordered that airborne forces in the United Kingdom would be formed. The Army Air Corps comprised of a number of units, the Glider Pilot Regiment, for example, the Parachute Regiment, and for some time, the Special Air Service.
I joined the Army when I was 16 in 1939 in boy service and was trained in the Royal Engineers in the Ordnance Survey as a surveyor on map making. I applied for the Glider Pilot Regiment and was accepted and commenced my training in mid-43. The training was initially on Tiger Moth with the powered aircraft, the little old biplane that was used, followed up by the light glider, the Hotspur, and finally onto Horsa, which was to be my operational aircraft, the Horsa glider. My squadron's job on D-Day was to take in the Air Landing Brigade of the 6th Airborne Division, which consisted of the Royal Ulster Rifles, the Ox and Bucks Light Infantry, a detachment of them, of course, made the famous landing on Pegasus Bridge, captured Pegasus Bridge, and the Devon Dorsets. These 3 infantry regiments, in conjunction with artillery, Royal Engineers, and other corps units, formed the 6th Air Landing Brigade. We, in actual fact, took in the Royal Ulster Rifles and landed in the early evening of D-Day. The operation began about 2 days before with the briefing, the aircrew briefing. There was extensive use of sand tables and models. For instance, on D-Day, there's some excellent models produced of the whole of the Normandy beach area, which we would see, and we actually knew which part of the coast we'd coast in on, and we could see and what it was going to be like. The next most important thing was the actual loading. If we were carrying a load at all, it was essential to get the right centre of gravity on the glider, and brief the crew on safety drills, means of getting out. With them and then with us. We would then be down on the towpath, the runway, at some about 3 or 4 hours beforehand, and it was always quite a scene. You'd have about 30 gliders, 30 tugs, and the whole station were down there, quite a lot of people milling around, and the tug aircraft would line up with the ropes attached to the gliders on the side, with the gliders staggered in pairs up through the main runway. One of the problems was to get the whole batch of aircraft off and airborne and in a decent package as quick as possible. And this did require very, very quick work on the ground crew's part. And we'd aim to get off about every half a minute or so each glider, this sort of thing. So it will take about 15-20 minutes to get a squadron airborne. The squadrons would then form up with the other squadrons till you had a complete armada setting forth. We coasted out over Chichester and set off towards France. It took about 30 minutes to go across the channel, and the planned release was at 1,500 foot over the river and the canal, and this would involve then a turn of 180 degrees back onto a northerly heading and land into wind. It was quite congested then. There were 250 gliders coming in the stream, obviously with 250 tug aircraft, that's 500 aircraft, and somewhere about 14 or 18 close support squadrons of fighters. So there was an awful number of aircraft milling around over in that evening. Well, the basic idea was to land as quick as possible. It was no good just flying around possibly under enemy small arms fire. So it was essential to land as fast or as quick as possible, all other things being equal. The landing on Pegasus Bridge, the Kurdimar landing at Pegasus Bridge, they released at 6,000 feet, some 7-8 miles away, and glided in. They needed the silent approach, and that was the essential item. It depended very, very much on the circumstances, but normally it was a case of get down as quick as you can. The role of the glider pilot after landing depended very, very much on the load he was carrying. If, as we were, we carried normal infantry, we formed up as the glider pilots formed up as infantry units and took on local defence jobs or any other specialised jobs the commanders would require. If, however, you took in a load, such as the Royal Artillery guns, the technique was to drop one or two of the crew members from the gun team and train up the glider pilots to operate the guns, and so extra ammunition, petrol, stores could be carried in lieu of. Well over 50% of the glider pilot regiment were committed on D-Day, and there was another airborne division, the 1st Airborne Division, waiting in the wings for future use. And there were not enough glider pilots remaining in UK, not committed on D-Day, to take in the 1st Airborne Div Airland Brigade. So we had priority to be evacuated from Normandy. And we all had nice little pieces of paper, return tickets, where we marched down to the beaches and presented it to the sailors, and they brought us home.
During the 3 months following the successful glider landings in Normandy, 16 major airborne operations were cancelled due to the rapid advance of the ground forces. Finally, in September 1944, Montgomery was given the go-ahead for Operation Market Garden. One part of this was the landing by glider of elements of the British 1st Airborne Division near the Dutch town of Arnhem.
The landings at Arnhem were very, very similar. There were landings on 3 days because of the vast number of troops who were put in. And the landings were, again, very, very conventional. There were a certain amount of enemy aircraft around on the 2nd and 3rd days. Some gliders did get shot down with their tug aircraft, but it was really quite a conventional airborne landing initially. The withdrawal took place after 9 days. The division was ordered to pull out. Unfortunately, there were quite a number of soldiers in various parts of the area who were not informed. I was one of those, and we weren't aware that the withdrawal had taken place till the following day, when it all suddenly went very, very quiet, and the Germans started moving around the whole of the area and a lot more freedom. At that stage I was taken prisoner and taken into Germany. To fly the Horsa was, I don't think, technically difficult. It was physically difficult. It was with a full load on tow. It was extremely hard work. After about 20 minutes you had had enough. Once you were off tow and released, it was a beautiful aircraft to fly, do wing overs and generally perform the normal gyrations of an aircraft. But on tow it was rather hard work. The necessity for 2 pilots was only because of the physical workload, but also the fact that it was an assault glider, and as such there was the danger of one of the crew members becoming injured or killed during the actual landing, in which case, of course, with 28 soldiers in the back, the pilot killed or incapacitated would have been most unfortunate. After the war, the glider pilot regiment continued in existence, although on a very, very much run-down scale. Gliders were flown up to about 1950, but from 50 onwards they were converted onto, the glider pilots were converted onto Oster's light aircraft and flew worldwide with the AOP squadrons, AOP flights in Korea, in the emergency in Malaya, and also in Germany up until 1957, when the glider pilot regiment was disbanded.
On September the 1st, 1957, the present Army Air Corps was formed. This was from units of the glider pilot regiment and the AOP squadrons. Army aviation had grown over the years, but certain units had become obsolete. For example, gliders were no longer used. The last glider operation was the Rhine crossing in 1945. And a few of those glider pilots then transferred and flew Osters in conjunction with the AOP squadrons as liaison units. The AOP still carried out their duties as observation, looking for the guns and plotting the enemy. But it was thought that both these organisations must be joined together because they both worked for separate organisations. And so, because of this, they formed the 2nd Army Air Corps as a cohesive unit. The Army Air Corps since 1957 has served in Germany, Cyprus, Aden, the Radfan, Kenya, Hong Kong, Borneo, Malaya, and of course 1982 the Falklands, and just recently in the Gulf War.
I personally flew for 3 years in Malaya over the, it was very, very interesting. It was all individual work, it was deep jungle reconnaissance work, working with various infantry units, I supported Second Six Gurkhas for 2 years. Really, I used to live with them and drink with them and fly for them. Best job, I think, was dropping their Gurkha rum. They didn't used to trust the Royal Air Force to drop their Gurkha rum. They used to get us to go and drop their bottles of rum, all nicely wrapped up to them, into the jungle.
Osters and their pilots had earned the lasting respect of commanders and soldiers of both sides, but the new demands of modern warfare had relegated the Osters to a training role at Middle Wallop. Middle Wallop started as a flying school. However, the threat of German bombers in English skies transformed it to a key sector station in 10th Group Fighter Command during the summer of 1940. When the threat had passed, Middle Wallop became home to a succession of aircraft, from the night-fighting bow fighters of 604 Squadron to Mustangs of the United States Army Air Force. During the Cold War, Middle Wallop's grass runways could have disappeared, but the creation of the Army Air Corps gave it a new lease of life.
Middle Wallop is the home of the Army Air Corps, and this is where all our training is done. Not only the pilots, but also our ground crew and our REME technicians are all trained here as well. There's probably 2,500 military people here at any one time, but also a large civilian membership too, some 300 or 400. I have a large civilian contract here which runs all the aircraft maintenance and a large portion of the flying instructors are civilian. There's some 70 aircraft here, Chipmunks, Gazelles, Lynx, and then the historic aircraft, Sioux, Skeeter, Oster and Beaver.
I started pilot training in 1965 here at Middle Wallop. The basic trainer at the time was the Chipmunk, followed by the Oster during the intermediate stage, finally finishing up on the current fixed-wing in-service aircraft, which at the time was the Beaver. The Beaver is built by de Havilland of Canada. It's powered by a Pratt & Whitney Wasp Junior engine, which develops 450 horsepower. It's capable of lifting up to 6 people, pilot plus 5, in the passenger role. Again, that can be modified for various other roles. It has a medivac role where you can take 2 stretchers with stretchered patients and a sitting orderly, plus the pilot. It can also be used for free-fall parachuting, static line parachuting, or supply dropping using internal loads on parachutes or external loads which are jettisoned from the underwing racks which can be fitted. The Beaver is a very nice aircraft to fly. The controls are well balanced and harmonised, and from the pilot's point of view, that makes life very easy. There are no hidden vices in it, and it's very unlikely it's going to get you into a situation that you can't recover from with comparative ease. We have one based in Vientiane in Laos during the late 60s, which was a detachment aircraft from the flight in Malaya and Singapore. On the pull-out from Singapore in 1970, that particular aircraft was left behind with one pilot in Vientiane and then attached to the British Embassy. And story has it, from good authority from the pilot concerned, that the last American prisoner of war was brought out of North Vietnam in that particular airplane, which is in the museum at Middle Wallop. The other detachment from that particular flight was up in Nepal, and that was supporting the Gurkhas in Dhahran. Other exercises throughout the world and expeditions, the Beaver has followed most of them round. It's done the White Nile expedition. It did the Zaire River expedition. It also did the Darien Gap in South America with great success, and all people in connection with the expeditions have spoken very highly of the Beaver. The Beaver also operated in Northern Ireland extensively from the beginning of the present troubles in 1969, right up until it was replaced in 1990. Again, a very successful platform over there for low-level and medium-level camera work, where it's proved invaluable in saving many lives in this particular role.
The Beaver had proved to be a real old soldier for the army in Germany, Aden, Borneo and Northern Ireland. But after nearly 30 years of service, it was replaced by the Briton-Norman Islander. Used as a utility aircraft, its main role is that of low-level photographic reconnaissance. It is now the only fixed-wing frontline aircraft used by the Army Air Corps, as since the mid-50s, the helicopter has taken an ever more important role.
Roald Hafner was an Austrian aero engineer who came to the United Kingdom in about 1935-36. And on the outbreak of war, because he was an Austrian, he was immediately interned as an alien because of the Second World War. A few months later, people realized that his expertise was being wasted, and he was released from internment and took part in experimentation on rotary aircraft. He had already in 1936 prepared a very basic helicopter that, although it was tethered, did actually take off from the ground. He developed things like the rotor buggy and the rotor chute. And in later years, he went on to produce the Skeeter and the Sycamore helicopter. The Joint Experimental Helicopter Unit was formed at Old Sarum because it was the introduction of the helicopter onto the battlefield. Very similar to 1914, the aeroplane was new, the helicopter was a new machine. And the Royal Air Force and the Army carried out trials for a number of years, how you could use the helicopter in its new environment. Should you put a gun on it? Can it carry troops? These things we take for granted nowadays, but in those days it was very new. And in 1956, this unit was mobilized as an operational unit and went to Suez for the invasion of Egypt in 1956. And it was a very successful operation, the first of its kind anywhere in the world. There were two types of helicopters used at Suez. One was the S-55 American helicopter and the British Sycamore aircraft. A few years later, the Joint Helicopter Unit was disbanded, and the Royal Air Force then took back all the helicopters under the Royal Air Force umbrella. And the Army was imposed with a weight factor of 4,000 pounds on each aircraft. So the Army actually stepped backwards and continued to fly Osters for a number of years, until the Army got its first helicopter, the Skeeter.
The Skeeter was to be used by the Army as a stopgap until the Scout was ready. Delays forced the purchase of the French Alouette, which proved equal to the task and flew successfully for years.
The Army Air Corps helicopters in the very early years were obviously small aircraft and could carry very few men. And they certainly did not carry any machine guns or any anti-tank missiles in that day, because it was perceived that those aircraft would return to the role of reconnaissance aircraft as they were used in 1914 by the old stringbag aircraft. It was only later on, when the Americans in Korea and later in Vietnam used the helicopter as an assault weapon, that the British started to arm their helicopters. But at the present time, of course, the British Army does not have a purpose-built attack helicopter, and so weapons have been added on according to the role the aircraft was doing at that time. For example, the Scout was used as an anti-tank busting role in the Falklands. It took out Argentinian bunkers. Machine guns were put in the door in places like the Radfan and Aden, and in this year, of course, in Northern Ireland, where the Army helicopter still plays a very important role.
It's probably quite interesting. The Scout came into service in 1960. And when it first came into service, people thought it was a bit like a naughty school child, because it was incredibly disobedient and very unreliable. It would never do what it should do. Wasn't allowed to fly over buildings, over trees or over water, because they were regularly having engine failures. In a single engine helicopter, that means you've got to land immediately. And unless you're over open areas, it would mean actually the end of the aircraft and the crew. Then in the early 70s, they fitted the SS-11, French SS-11 anti-tank missile, and the Army Air Corps really sort of came of age as became a direct fire weapon system. And by the end of the 70s and the early 80s, the Scout really became a rugged, reliable, small aircraft which both the crews and the passengers really loved.
The Scout was proven to be adept in many roles and in many countries. In Hong Kong, for example, they helped to control the huge influx of illegal immigrants, many of whom were fleeing from the communist victors of the war in Vietnam.
When Argentina invaded the Falklands Islands, I was deployed with 2 para down to the South Atlantic to obviously be involved with the recapture of the islands. And I went with an advanced anti-tank flight of 3 Scout helicopters armed with the SS-11 missile. My enduring memory of the Falklands is when we arrived. If you can imagine arriving just before first light, strapped to the back of a civilian car ferry with my Scout and my flight, and the boat gently rolling as we came round Fanning Head into San Carlos water. You could hear the roar of the engine from the boat, and on Fanning Head we could see the SAS dispatching an Argentinian outpost, and the sort of sudden reality that this was actually war and no longer a game. Our main role was to take ammunition in to the forward companies who were actually involved with a firefight and extract casualties. If you can imagine that there would be a battle going on the top of a hill, we were literally landing on the back of the hill and dropping off the ammunition and picking up the casualties. During the 3-week conflict, Scouts and Gazelles rescued over 400 British soldiers who'd been shot or wounded, and every one of those soldiers survived. Some were picked up literally within 2 or 3 minutes of wounding because there happened to be a helicopter there. Some waited considerably longer, but they were a short 20-minute flight to the refrigeration bay at Ajax Bay, where there was a field surgical team all ready to give them the best expert surgery that there was available. Then as the war developed, we got into other roles besides casualty evacuation, and during the battle for Wireless Ridge, which was right at the end of the campaign, we used the French SS-11 missiles to knock out a Argentinian gun battery who was actually engaging the Scots Guards who were trying to capture Mount Tumbledown, and we were fortunately able to get round to the side and knock them out and stop them firing. For the CASEVAC role, we fitted 2 pods onto the outside of the aircraft, a bit like the MASH scenes you'll have seen from the film. They were basically a litter which was fitted onto the outside station here and ran basically down the side of the aircraft. This allowed us to pick up 2 stretcher casualties, and any other walking wounded type casualties could go in the back of the aircraft. For this we removed the SS-11 missile boom, which is this long piece of metal sticking out of here, which actually carried 2 missiles which fitted underneath. The SS-11 missile had a range of 3,000 metres, which was actually longer than any other weapon system we had in the Falklands, and was useful for not only knocking out armoured fighting vehicles, but also bunkers, buildings, and we eventually used it for knocking out a pack howitzer battery. The Scout will be particularly remembered for the buzz that the tail rotor makes. It's a very distinctive noise, and you can hear it from literally miles away. And I know that people who are waiting to be picked up during casualty evacuation would get a great sense of relief when they'd hear the buzz of Scouts come in, because they knew that obviously help was on the way. But the other thing that Scouts will be remembered for is the vast number of rivets that it took to put them together. And as you can see down here, there's just rows and rows and rows of them. And Scout pilots always say that a Scout is 10,000 rivets flying in close formation. The other thing that's interesting about the Scout is that we did a lot of night operations with it during the Falklands, but it's actually not a sophisticated night aircraft. It doesn't have all of the modifications that modern aircraft have today in the cockpit, particularly lighting. And also we were not equipped with night vision goggles. Now this is not a difficulty, you can fly at night, but landing in unlit areas by night without goggles is actually quite testing for the crew. And when you consider that we hadn't seen these locations by day and we were asked to go in by night to pick people up, you can imagine the sort of stress it would put the crew under.
Well, obviously the Army Air Corps have been given much larger helicopters since the 4,000-pound weight has been imposed. They now fly the Lynx Mark 7, and it's used as an anti-tank helicopter, and the Gazelle, which is used as a reconnaissance liaison aircraft. And so the responsibilities of the Army Air Corps as a fighting arm on the battlefield has grown considerably.
Well, the Army Air Corps is in existence to support the Army. It's one of the three direct fire arms that the Army's got, with the infantry and the Royal Armoured Corps as the other two. But within that rather overarching role, there are 5 specific roles that we carry out. Firstly, we conduct armed action, which is mostly with the Lynx with the anti-tank missiles at the moment, but also covers the use of machine guns mounted on the Lynx in support of the Royal Sussex Constabulary in Northern Ireland, amongst other places. Second role would be observation and reconnaissance. Principally we use the Gazelle for that. Thirdly, direction of fire, both artillery fire, mortar fire, and the control of aircraft in forward air controlling. Assistance with command and control, the sophisticated radio fit in our helicopters allows commanders to be moved about and kept in communication with great ease. And then lastly, limited movement of men and material. We're not support helicopters, but the Lynx does provide a very flexible helicopter which can move groups of men around the battlefield to conduct their business.
The Gazelle is a light observation and reconnaissance helicopter. It can also be used for a lot of liaison tasks, which nowadays it seems to be used more and more for the liaison jobs. For example, underslung load work. We can use it in the Casevac role, although we can only actually carry one lying casualty in it. And we also carry a lot of passengers on, especially VIP passengers around the country. The Gazelle has been used in Rhodesia, in the troubles there many years ago, also the Falklands, and it's been used recently in the Gulf War. It also operates extensively in Northern Ireland. It operates in Kenya, Belize, Cyprus, and it does deployments to Canada and America, and it also operates in Germany. For example, when I flew the aircraft in the Falklands, it was the only real way to get around the islands quickly because of the lack of roads and the boggy, marshy ground that is over there. Flying it in Kenya is a completely different experience because of the altitude and the heat, and we were used to count rhino and elephant in the big game reserves over there, which was a very enjoyable experience. Actually, initially learning to fly the Gazelle I found very difficult indeed, and I think most other pilots learning to fly this aircraft do find it very difficult, especially trying the initial few days as you try and hover it and keep it over the ground in one position. It's a very fast, agile helicopter as compared to some of the larger helicopters like a Lynx or a Chinook or Puma. And it's, I find, very enjoyable to fly. It's a little bit like the sports car of the helicopter world, really. It cruises at 125 knots and gives us an endurance of about 2.5 hours, depending on what aircraft engine you've got. Also, that gives us a range of about 300 miles. In the observation role, we have a GOA sight which is mounted in the roof on the left-hand pilot seat, above the left-hand pilot, and it's got a magnification of ×10 or ×2.5.
Here the tanks won't see it. They won't even hear it. The noise of their own engines will be too much for that.
We have two compasses, one up here and one here, both powered by different sources, so that if one fails, the other one will still work. The same thing with the attitude indicators. We have a small one over here, and powered by DC voltage, and a larger one, which is the main one, powered by AC voltage, to back each other up. We also have two height indicators. Here, this one tells us the height above sea level, and this radout tells us the height above ground. The aircraft is above the ground. Here we have a instrument called a Doppler, which is a navigational aid, and we can put grid references into that, and it will give us a bearing and distance to that grid reference. Moving on down here, we have a tactical radio here, a UHF radio here, and a VHF radio here, which is used mainly for talking to air traffic control units around the country.
The Lynx's role was originally brought in the mid to late 70s as a troop carrier, and was later configured or reconfigured to carry the TOW missile system as the Army moved on to anti-tank operations. Having used the Scout with SS-11, it then went on to the Lynx using the American TOW missile system. Now the TOW system is a little bit outdated for this generation, however it's still quite effective, and with the thermal imaging system which is now fitted to the Lynx, it is effective both day and night and in bad weather, which is something that we're practicing now within the Army Air Corps to give ourselves a 24-hour capability. Technically, it's a very fast aircraft. It currently holds the world speed record for helicopter flight, just over 400 kilometers an hour, unbeaten up to now. The rotor head is a special to Lynx design, a semi-rigid rotor head made purely out of titanium. It has no hinges, and therefore it's a very maneuverable aircraft. Two Rolls-Royce GM engines putting out about 800 shaft horsepower each, and the latest Lynx are now all fitted with the composite main rotor blade, which is a Westland British experimental rotor project design, enhancing the aircraft's speed capability and reducing vibration, made purely out of composite materials, no metal in it at all. It's seen a lot of action in Northern Ireland, and I've been to both Northern Ireland and the Gulf, and I've actually used the aircraft in anger in the Gulf, firing at Iraqi tanks. And I think now the future for the Lynx is looking quite good. We're looking to hold on to it for at least another 10 years, well into the next century anyway. My experiences in the Gulf, I had virtually in 3 days. I had a crash on a Lynx, which doesn't speak very highly for me, but virtually 2 days after that I was back up to flying, and I was in the only Army Air Corps engagement against Iraqi tanks. The crash was a result of flying at night time in bad weather. These things happen. I was on a mission which had to be completed and paid the price, but luckily both myself and my co-pilot walked away from it. 2 days later I'd gone in the road party into Iraq, and I was put back into an aircraft and joined the Army Air Corps' only anti-tank engagement with TOW so far, destroying a T-55 myself, and the other two Lynx that were with me managed to engage MTLBs and T-55s. I think it was a total of 70 destroyed between us. So started at a low and ended up on a high, really.
Any aircraft marking 2 miles southwest of Alpha 051, you're dropping flares on friendlies. This is Chieftain. I say again, any station, any aircraft dropping flares 2 miles southwest of Alpha 051, this is Chieftain. You're dropping flares on friendlies. on the route up.
30,
Charlie
40 Bravo. Do you
Okay,
want us
keep
to
coming
engage?
forward.
Over.
Have you got the grid of the entry points through that?
Okay, into constraints.
In constraints. Okay, camera rolling, camera is rolling.
3 black, solid selection.
And fine now.
Fire flag. Missiles running.
Oh, roger, off it goes, down the range. Roger.
Impact.
Okay.
Another one. In constraints.
Roger, let's get above a missile.
Solid selection. 3 black, standby.
I'm
In constraints.
Firing now.
Engage uniform. Fire flag. Missiles running.
Roger, away it goes, what a beauty.
Oh, you darling, good shot.
Oh.
In constraints.
Which one haven't I shot yet? Okay, fine now.
Fire flag. Missiles running. Good shot. In constraints.
Okay, got a net missile running. This is great.
This is
More
sick.
fun than something that is a lot of fun.
That's what we came here to do. In constraints, 3 black, solid selection.
Okay, get out of the dust cloud. Other come up.
Just coming up. One.
Okay, keep coming up. Keep coming up. That's good.
In constraints.
I don't think I already have a target. Roger, firing now. Constraints?
Yeah, in constraints. Fire flag. Missiles running.
Whoosh.
Shot.
Roger.
Coming down your location.
Okay, I think I'll take out the last one. In constraints?
In constraints.
Fine.
They're up. Fire flag. Running. What a beaut.
Did you say artillery was coming down over your location, Evan?
Good shot. Great shot.
Nice down by 2. Roger. Okay, could you tell 4-3 then?
I believe that a helicopter in the British Army is a very important weapon, and it has taken the place of the cavalry and the tank as the most formidable weapon on the battlefield. And no modern army in the world can be successful in the battle without the helicopter in the assault role.
The recent round of cuts in the defence budget as a result of options for change almost exclusively left the Army Air Corps untouched. Now this is an indication that the Army, and indeed the government as a whole, really views the use of helicopters on the modern battlefield as a very exciting and logical extension of a combat arm. The Army Air Corps is due to receive a new helicopter into service towards the end of the century. It's going to be an attack helicopter. Now this has been approved by all levels in the Ministry of Defence, that what the Army needs is an attack helicopter, and then the Army Air Corps will operate it for the Army. This helicopter will replace the Lynx in the anti-tank and armed role, and the Lynx will replace the Gazelle in the reconnaissance role. Now there are several contenders for this competition, principally from overseas. So the first one is the McDonnell Douglas Apache, which came to such prominence in the Gulf War. There's the Bell Whiskey Model Cobra, which is a twin-engined aircraft. There's the South African Royvark. There's the Eurocopter Tiger. There's an Italian variant of the A129 Mongoose. And then lastly, there's a Boeing Sikorsky aircraft, which is a little bit behind the others in terms of the likely date it comes into production, the Comanche. Now, all of these manufacturers are, as we speak, making preparations, submissions to the Ministry of Defence as to what they would propose. It's a complete package for the helicopter, training of the ground crew, air crew and the technicians, and indeed how we're going to look after it in the field. And these submissions will be scrutinised by the Ministry of Defence to see how closely they meet the statement of requirement which we wrote some years ago now as to what we needed an attack helicopter to do. This is radically going to change the way we are treated by the rest of the Army and the Army Air Corps. We are going to have a flexible and lethal new weapon system which is going to be able to deploy in all the spectrum of conflict. That's to say, from low-level conflict in internal security operations through increasing levels of tension to all-out war. This particular weapon system has an application at every single level. We in the Army Air Corps are offering young people an opportunity to fly this aircraft. It's an exciting prospect, and the Army Air Corps is in the business of keeping the Army in the forefront of technology.
I'm probably very prejudiced here, but the Beaver is probably the best aircraft that the Army ever purchased. Certainly all the air crews that have been in connection with it would support me on that one. I think most of the engineering side would as well. And last but not least, the passengers who flew worldwide in the Beaver would probably second my thoughts on that particular aspect of the Beaver.
When the Scout left service, there's no doubt that it was the best loved of all the aircraft we'd had to date. It was reliable, rugged, and such fun to fly. And everyone has this enduring memory of going out and about in a Scout with 1,000 pounds of fuel. The cry that Scout pilots always say to all their passengers, there's no doubt, go by Scout.
I've been flying now for 10 years, and most of that time's been spent flying the Gazelle helicopter, and in all that time I've only had one thing go wrong, which was an alternator caption, which is certainly not a major emergency. So I think it's a very reliable and a very enjoyable aircraft to fly.
Obviously there's going to be a lot of rivalry between us, but having flown all the Army Air Corps aircraft in the latter half, I think nothing beats the Lynx, both for power and manoeuvrability. The Lynx is the aircraft to fly at this time in the Army. There'll be a lot of Gazelle people being sick over that, you know that, innit?